Tower of Babel Part 2. Last week, we spent quite a bit of detail looking at the three main sins behind the Tower of Babel. We saw the first sin was rebellion. God said, scatter, fill the earth. They said, we are not going to scatter. We're going to stay here. The second one was idolatry. Whether, they were going to build this great big tower, and this tower was going to become the center of worship. But idolatry is anything that comes before God. We'll look at that if we get time. The other one was pride. They said, let us make a name for ourselves. They were not interested in making a name for God. They were not interested in exalting God. They were interested in making a name for themselves. So rebellion, idolatry, and pride were the three main sins behind the Tower of Babel. Now, there's a lot of speculation, and I know I covered part of this last week. What was the Tower of Babel? What did it look like? What was it really? What was its real purpose? And a whole lot of speculation. We do know, and I put this in from after last week, we do know that the Old Testament people were very, very intelligent. We know before the flood that they had made organs and all kinds of musical instruments. We know that they had made all kinds of things after the flood. They were very, very intelligent. If you look at the pyramids, and I'll mention them several times, history says that the pyramids were possibly built around the same time as the Tower of Babel, or at least close to the same time. And we can look at the pyramids because they're still standing, and we can see super intelligence. I've never been to the pyramids. I've seen pictures, I've seen close-ups, I've read some of the unique characteristics of the pyramids. The rocks, the bricks themselves, and I don't like bricks, but the blocks of rock that they had, or mortar, some of them are 6 and 8 feet by 3 and 4 feet, and 2 or 3, 4 feet high. They weighed tons. How did they get them all the way up to the top? They didn't have cranes. How did they get those humongous blocks all the way to the top of the pyramids? Science has some ideas with pulleys and ropes, but it took some intelligence to figure out, okay, we're going to build these great, even if they were only 3 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet, those are still heavy, and that would be a small block. That would still be very heavy to have to carry all the way up to the top of the pyramids. The other thing about the pyramids is the rocks fit so tight. They made the rock, got it up to the different layers, laid it in place. The rocks are so tight, you can't get a piece of paper in between the rocks. They are so closely fit together. Now, you can't, let me back up. The sink in the print shop, I wash my hands a lot. And right in front of it is the brick to the original building. you could get a whole book between bricks on some of those. I mean, I don't know if he was drunk when he laid them or what, but they were so accurate. They built them so accurate that when they stacked them up, one fit right on top, butted right up against the other one. And it took a brilliant person to design that and to figure it all out. They had a complete language. I love to read some of the prehistoric books. By the way, how can you have prehistory? You can't have, history is history, and you can't have history before history. You know, that's a crazy thing evolutionists. We have prehistoric dinosaurs. Well, he can't be prehistoric because prehistoric would still be historic. Does that make sense to everybody? But they had one language. And what I was going to say is, you know, they pictured the early men as cavemen. You know, and jumping around, grunting, and no, they had a complete language. Some of the hieroglyphics that have been found, particularly in Egypt and down in that area, are very sophisticated. So they had written language. They knew how to make bricks and mortar. And as I said, they existed somewhere in the range of the pyramids, which are still an unfathomable building. How they built it. They started off down here, and then they moved in and moved in and moved in, so that when they get to the top, how did they keep them from falling? How many of you have been to Frankfurt, to the old state capitol, the old one? You've been to the old one, okay. Did you see those bricks? I'm sorry, the steps. There's a set of steps that goes from the first floor up to the second floor, and they are held together by gravity. They told me that, and it's like, we're going upstairs. I don't think so. Where's the elevator? But when they explained it, they had and this was back in the 1800s, they had it all calculated so that when they put the last section in, it kept everything else from moving. You can't move those steps unless you take out the last section that was put in. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. It's a marvel of engineering. I mean, if they had told me to build steps without any support, I'd have still been trying to figure it out. Somebody was super smart. They had the angles, the weight. They had everything figured out so that when they put that last section in, it locked everything else in place. And you can go up and down 1,000 times a day. Imagine that on the size of a pyramid. How did they keep it from caving in? They didn't have steel beams holding it up. They didn't have tree stumps holding it up. How did they build it so it goes up to a point without caving in? Got to be pretty smart to figure that out. So they were highly intelligent. And I read this one time, well, twice. It's very speculative, but there have been a couple of people, two or three out of a few million, that actually believe that they had electricity before the Tower of Babel. And so how did they come up with that? Well, it turns out in all of their digging, they found an invoice from Duke Energy for the late fee on the energy, on the electric that they used to build it with. but they found an invoice from Duke Energy underneath where the Tower of Babel was. I'm joking. Okay. But there's a couple of things that they have found which, if used correctly, could have generated electricity back shortly after the flood, certainly during the Tower of Babel. Now, notice what God said in Genesis 11. The Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this," the Tower of Babel, "they begin to do. And if they succeed in building the Tower of Babel, nothing will be restrained from them." If they succeed in building this tower, there is nothing that they will not do and cannot do if they want to. It was very huge. We know that because their goal was to reach unto heaven, not into heaven. We touched on that briefly last week. But it was going to be very, very big, very tall, bigger than any other building in that time. Now, it was big enough to reach up unto heaven. And sometimes we read over something and read it in our mind without reading the words. It did not say they wanted to build a tower whose top would reach into heaven. They weren't going into the heavens. They were going unto the heavens. Look up the difference between into and unto. One is they're going into the upper atmosphere. The other is they're going unto the upper. It's like I go into the vestibule, or I go unto the vestibule. You see the difference? One I stop short, I go unto it. The other one I go into it. So they were going unto the heavens. Nothing indicates that they had any thoughts of going beyond heaven. But we got into the question, which heaven? There are three heavens. There's the heaven where the birds fly, that we breathe, that we, climb mountains in. There's the heaven where the sun, the moon, and the stars are. And then there's the heaven where God himself dwells. So which heaven? Obviously, they had to be smart enough to know that they were not going to get up into the heaven where the sun, the moon, and the stars are. I've never been there, but I've talked to and read many instances of people who have climbed, what's the tallest mountain in the world? Is it Mount Everest? Mount Everest? They've tried to climb it. When you get up to a certain elevation, the oxygen gets real thin and you have trouble breathing. And if you keep going, you can actually pass out and die if you get up to where the oxygen is so thin that you can't get the oxygen you need for your body. So they had to have known that. They were, like I said, they were extremely intelligent. But many speculate it was simply an idolatrous house that would be dedicated to one of their false gods. We have the same thing today. False religions seem to really emphasize the building. I know you have, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Have you ever driven through Covington? Is very famous for this, and driven by some of the Catholic churches in Covington? What's one of the things you notice about the Catholic churches in Covington, or any other place for that matter? the architecture, and they are huge. Their churches are big, big. Somebody asked me today, now, is your church the one right off the interstate that's great big and you see from the interstate? And it's like, no, we're on the other side of the interstate. I told somebody that their steeple cost more than our whole church did. And probably true. But look at Jehovah's Witnesses. Now their church buildings are not built for church, they're built for brainwashing. So they don't worry as much about architecture. But have you ever seen the headquarters for the Jehovah's Witness? Humongous. Huge. Who is it? The Muslims? I think it's Muslims that built a mosque with 24 karat gold roof. Roof on the outside. 24 karat gold roof. Would you ever vote to put 10 karat gold on our roof? They build big and emphasize big and expensive. There's been a lot of monuments built to worship false gods. In fact, the worship of false gods was a major problem of Israel all the way down through the capture by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. When they came back from Assyria and back from Babylonia, you don't find Israel building idolatrous houses ever after that. Many people believe, and I tend to fall in this category, that it was some kind of an observatory. Now, did they have telescopes? There's not been any evidence found for telescopes, but there are other ways that you can study and worship. In Deuteronomy, one of the big sins God warned them about, unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, shouldst be driven to worship them and to serve them. So that was a problem that God warned them about. In Jeremiah, and I'm not going to read this, but they gathered wood, and from that wood they burned fire to heat the house. They burned fire to cook on, and then they took what was the stump left over and made a god out of it. Notice they made cakes to the Queen of Heaven. And I'm trying to find, and I'm not finding what I want. There's a story behind the Queen of Heaven. Who was she? What was she? I've been trying to find a definitive answer for a long time. Notice in Jeremiah again, be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. So over and over and over, God warned them against worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars. I think because they know they can't go into the outer space. They know that. So they were building some kind of an observatory so that they could look out and see the sun, the moon, and the stars and worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. Even today, people still worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. There are people that will not leave home until they check to see how the stars are lined up. And, they'll check the zodiac if the moon is in this place and the earth is in this place and the stars are lined up. Oh, it's going to be a terrible day. But they look to the sun, the moon, and the stars, even today, to worship as their God and their director. I read my horoscope years ago. I only read it a few times because I couldn't stop laughing. You know, you read your horoscope and it says, you're going to have a bad day today. Automatically, what's going to happen? It's in my mind, I'm going to have a bad day. So everything that happens in my mind is a result of my horoscope telling me I'm going to have a bad day. And they were just about that generic. You know, you're going to meet a stranger today. Wow, for me, that's like saying you're going to get a drink today. You know, they were very, very general, but there are people today who will not move and breathe until they check their horoscope. You know, people ask, what sign are you? And don't laugh, but there are evidently, there's two different charts for signs. My birthday, if you look at one chart, I am a Scorpion or something. If you look at the other chart, I'm something totally different. How do I know what I am? Even the zodiac can't agree with each other. But there are people that they worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. They do it by depending on the sun, moon, and stars to tell them what to do. We have something besides our spouse to tell us what to do. We have the Bible to tell us what to do. And if I want to know what the future holds, I look at God's Word and say, it's a wonderful day. I get more attention. Oh, it's cold, it's raining, it's a horrible day. Oh, no, it isn't. This is the day God made. Can God make a mistake? Well, no, I guess not. God made today. How can you say God made a terrible day? It's a wonderful day because God made it. But I find that in the Bible, not in zodiac, not in my horoscope, not, seeing how the stars line up and all of that. Anyway, next week we will get into, Lord willing, confounding the language. And what effect did that have